Much of the debate around Brexit continues to focus on its economic impact. For a look at the debate on both sides, I spoke with Giles. He's an economist and economics editor for the Financial Times. There are a lot of descriptors going on about the British economy, but we're in a period of uncertainty, certainly politically and with Brexit. How would you describe the British economy at this point?
I'd say it's treading water at this point. It's been better than people thought before the referendum. Before people thought the Leave vote would itself trigger quite a downturn. Most people thought that. Even people who were wanting to leave thought that was a big risk. And that didn't happen, but we have slowed, the economy has slowed, and it's a time when the rest of the world has been accelerating. So our relative performance, Britain used to be, at the time of the referendum, probably the top or the second top in the G7. Now it's at the bottom of the G7. That's not because the UK economy has gone into recession. It's slowed, it's now growing at a tepid pace, but everywhere else has accelerated.
The Governor of the Bank of England said recently that if it weren't for Brexit, that this economy would be booming. What are the factors that have really played into that change?
There are two reasons why the economy has slowed, and which you can directly link to the Brexit vote. One is the uncertainty, which has caused businesses to be slightly reluctant to invest. So it's not that they've been stopping any spending at all. It's just when new projects come up, they think maybe it's time to wait rather than do it straight away. So we've seen a really rather low growth in business investment, lower than we would have expected to have at this sort of time. And the second is consumer spending. So because sterling, the pound, fell very sharply after the Brexit vote, the reduction in the value of the currency has meant that imports have become significantly more expensive. Inflation has gone up to 3%, but wages haven't followed inflation higher, so people have become worse off very directly from the Brexit vote. And so we're now seeing that in household spending numbers being pretty weak. So those two things you can directly link to the Brexit vote.
And yet the optimists will point to relatively decent employment numbers and, yes, as you said, better than expected growth. Is that a surprise?
It was a surprise that the economy didn't fall further after the vote. So what really happened was, the reason there were predictions saying it would be a big hit to the economy immediately was because people thought, well, Brexit's unlikely to be good for the UK economy in the long term. And if people know that, then they're hardly likely to go out and spend. In fact, that's a time they'll go and save some money, just tighten their belts, difficult times ahead, and that was the expectation, and that didn't come to pass. That didn't come to pass at the second half of 2016, second half of last year. In fact, if anything, we saw spending accelerating, household spending, and so what we saw was incomes weren't rising, so we saw households actually running down savings. So the big mistake was, from economic forecasters, they predicted people would save more, and actually they saved less. But you can't keep saving less forever. And now we're seeing the hangover from the quite rapid spending of last year, and that's why it's slowing at the moment.
Obviously, a big part of the debate about Brexit is economic. How would you characterize the two sides? Because there are economists who argue that leaving is going to be an economic boon to Britain.
So there are two sides. Let's put aside the short-term effect on the economy. Most of the argument is about the long term, and so on the sort of the Remain side, or the side which didn't want to leave the EU, the fear really is that the EU is Britain's largest trading partner with other free trade areas. It's about half, or maybe even more than half, of the UK's trade is with Europe. We are going to be erecting barriers. We're going to be chucking sand into the cogs of our relationship with Europe. So trade is likely to decline. We don't know exactly how much, but it will decline with the EU after Brexit. That then has an effect on productivity, on competition. Things won't work quite as smoothly as now, because trading relationships that existed, which people and companies wanted, won't exist in the same degree thereafter, and that's a loss. And on the other side, there might be gains from better trading relationships with other non-EU countries, the US, China, and so the trade-off really is, are we going to lose more from worse trading position with the EU, or gain more because be outweighed by better trading positions with other countries? Now, most economists think the losses are bigger than the gains, quite a lot bigger, in fact.
Depending on what kind of a negotiated divorce this is, and assuming that this divorce proceeds as it is expected to, how does that affect those arguments or the economic balance then?
Well, I think the divorce is really, the way to think about it is, if you think about the cogs of the British economy, if you think about them as they're sort of sitting here, and next to it we've got a bucket of sand, and we just don't know how much sand we're going to pour into this rather well-functioning gearbox we've got right at the moment. Our customs, is it going to be really hard to get lorries across the English Channel to France and back? If we go for a very hard Brexit, we're expecting that those sorts of movements will get much, much more difficult. You can't have people flowing freely between the UK and the continent. And that depends on what we agree in the divorce deal and the future relationship with the EU. So we don't know quite how much grit we're going to put into that part of the working relationship. And I think that's the key part of the divorce and future relationship agreement with the EU that we don't know. The more antagonistic it gets between the UK and the EU, the more grit and sand gets poured in, and the bigger the downsides are. But then also, the bigger the gap between us and the EU, the more ability Britain has to do deals with other countries. But again, so it's how much is that really going to benefit Britain and other countries, and can that really be a big offset? And you think about it, you'd have to increase trade with China by about tenfold to get what you're likely to lose with your big market right next door to us.
So put the politics into this now for me, because obviously it's at this point it appears quite confusing in terms of the political divisions that are there. How is that going to affect, do you think, the kind of, I guess, not only the negotiations but the economic outcome too?
Well, the politics are pretty much everything, both in the UK side and on the EU side. So in the UK, the politics means that if the government wanted to both meet the referendum decision, so we had to leave the EU, but also was in tune with sort of the weight of the British public, so including the people who voted to stay, then you would have thought, well, actually we'd have a very soft Brexit. We'd be out of the EU, but still as close to our European partners as we are now. But that's not where politics is. The politics is going for a much harder, much sort of cleaner and harder divorce than that. And then on the other side, there's on the European side, the politics also quite means that there's no real desire to be particularly generous to the UK, because you don't want to show that someone who leaves your club can actually get pretty much the same deal they had when they were inside the club. And that might not be the best for their economies, but it does work politically. So I think in both countries, both in the UK and in the EU 27, the politics is pushing us apart, where the economics says we should be staying as close together as we possibly can.
What should we be watching for here?
I think we should be watching in the near term for companies beginning to put in place contingency plans. So are they going to be doing things like renting a lot of warehouse space because they can't have their factories working so closely, because they can't necessarily guarantee lorries will come in as quickly as they did, and with so little time. So that sort of thing, companies putting in contingency plans. And then as we get closer and closer to March 2019, it's really whether we have a deal that means that, legally speaking, all the things that just happen seamlessly at the moment, like aeroplanes coming in and out, all these are bound up at the moment with European laws. Do we have a replacement for them? Because if we don't, we could be in a situation where we had a catastrophic Brexit, where actually the legal ability to do things like run nuclear power stations, aeroplanes, pretty much anything in the economy could break down. That's not very likely.
I was going to say that's the apocalyptic.
But it is possible, because that's the way the law works. And if we don't have an ability to do something else, if we actually have a complete breakdown, so it's not just a no deal, but it's an antagonistic no deal, where actually both sides want to punish each other, because it would hurt both sides, but it would hurt us more.
You say that's not likely, though.
It shouldn't be likely, because actually it's in no one's interests. But you know what exactly people's interests are is quite difficult in a negotiation. And if one side says, "Oh, it's not in their interest," they'd never do it, and they want to test that, you might get quite close before people really see the whites of the other side's eyes and see who's going to blink first.
As a citizen, are you worried?
I am worried, because I think there are potential big risks for the UK and for Europe as a bloc. So I'm worried that in the end we can't come to an agreement that satisfies everyone. And that just might not be possible, because Britain ultimately is asking to leave the club and retain quite a lot of the benefits of the club and not pay anything really very much for it. And that might, and if we're not willing to move, then it's quite likely the other side will say, well, that's not a deal for us. And so you can see how a deal could not happen.
Thank you very much for your expertise.
That's a pleasure.